All right. I think as people file in, I'm just going to do a little introduction. Welcome, everyone, to the official launch of Thyme Travellers, a speculative anthology of Palestinian, or an anthology of Palestinian speculative fiction, I should say. I have to say, for us at Fernwood, this has been like a great experience publishing this book. We're so happy to see how widely this book has been received and all the different spaces that it's going to. And the process of co-creation was also really wonderful. For this launch, we have a exclusive discount for our web purchases on the book that I'll leave in the chat. So I'll leave like a discount code in the chat that people can use to buy the book. It'll be active for today until the weekend. So please take advantage of that if you so wish. And yeah, I'm going to pass it over to the editor, Sonia, who's going to introduce everyone, and we'll get the discussion going. Thank you.
Thanks, Art. If there's a lot of noise, I have a puppy, and so she's making a lot of noise over there. But first, I wanted to plug two projects that are helping people in Gaza right now. There's workshops for Gaza. I'm going to try to get it to work here. No, it's not going to work. It's workshops and then the numeral 4 Gaza and Gaza funds. Those are two projects that are very vital for keeping people alive during this genocide. Yeah, so I wanted to kind of say, first of all, thank you everybody for coming. And I am thinking of this as a way for us to talk about Palestine, Palestine's futures, but also I want to be able to have a space where we can talk about craft, because we're seldom put on panels and given the opportunity to really get into what we do as a writer. So some of my questions are going to be about craft, and you're free to make those craft questions about Palestine, of course. But first we're going to, I'm going to go around and we'll introduce everybody. If you're not a panelist, we ask that you do shut off your video to make it easier for us to see each other, and mute, obviously. There's going to be questions after, and so there's going to be a speaker list for people who want to ask some questions, and Art will take care of that. So I'm Sonia Sulaiman. I edited Thyme Travellers, and I write speculative fiction that's inspired by Palestinian folklore. Usually short stories, but I'm working on my first novel. I also have some free zines that are about Palestinian folklore, and I curate a reading list of Palestinian speculative fiction. So if you want to check that out, it's on my website. My zines are on itch.io. And yeah, we'll go on to Jumaana. Would you like to introduce yourself? We'll just go around like in order.
Hey. Hi everyone, my name's Jumaana Abdu. I'm coming to you from the land of the Cabral clan of the Dark Nation in Sydney, Australia. I'm an author. My debut novel, Translations, came out this year with Vintage, which is the literary imprint of Penguin in Australia. My short story in the collection is called Down Under, and during the day I'm a medical doctor.
Great, am I next? Great. I'm Nadia Afifi. I'm coming from Denver, Colorado. I have a trilogy that came out starting in 2020 during the pandemic with Flame Tree Press. Trilogy about clones, cults, and consciousness. The first book is A Sentient. Also had a number of short stories published in Clark's World, magazine of fantasy and science fiction, and my next novel with Flame Tree Press is coming out in May of 2025, and it is partially inspired by Petra and Jordan and Nabatean civilization. Yeah, great to be here.
Layla?
I'm Layla Goushey. I'm a poet, essayist. I write fiction. I teach at a community college, and I edit a magazine, Ballady Magazine, and happy to be here. Happy to be here with you all.
Rana?
Hello, I'm Rana Othman, or Rana Othman in Arabic. This is my first publication. It's like a dream come true for me, so I'm so excited. I live in the Bay Area in California, and I did live in Palestine from 2001 to 2006 and around middle school. And during the day, I'm an accountant. So very, very exciting stuff. I'm so excited to be here.
Elise?
Hello, I am Elise Stephens. I am in Seattle, Washington. I have several short stories out there in the world in Analog, Escape Pod, Faya, and some other places. During the day, I am a homeschool mom to my two kiddos who are 8 and 11. And you can find more about my books and going-ons at elisestephens.com. That's my name.com. It is really cool to be here with all of you.
Samah? Samah? Did you want to go?
Sorry, I didn't hear my name.
Oh, I'm
Hi,
sorry.
everyone.
Said
It's all good. I'm
Sorry,
Samah.
incorrectly.
It's all good. Hi, everyone. I'm Samah Fadil. I'm a Palestinian writer, journalist turned writer, and I'm really happy to be here today. I'm speaking from Tiohtià:ke, also known as Montreal in Canada. And yeah, thanks for the opportunity, and happy to be here.
Ziyad?
Hi, I'm coming to you from the unceded territory of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, also known as Vancouver. This is my first thing actually getting published. I'm coming more from a filmmaking and screenwriting background, but I write pretty much anything from poetry to essays to articles. And I have my first novel coming out in August from by Penguin Random House. And yeah, very happy to be here.
And Emad?
Emad Aysha. I'm currently in Cairo, Egypt. I'm originally an academic and a journalist, but the academic market dried up and the translation market dried up, and a lot of the journalism. So I finally got into writing science fiction beginning 2015. I'm a member of the Egyptian Society for Science Fiction and the Egyptian Writers Union. I have one small anthology to my name. I had to get friends to translate it for me into Arabic. It's called The Digital Hydra. And I have one academic book on science fiction to my name. I'm co-editor, co-author. I'll put the link in here. And my very first published science fiction story was a Palestinian story, 2016. I'll dig up the link and put it up here. And I published in Palestine Plus 100. This is my, you could say, my second or third, sorry, Palestinian science fiction story.
Thank you so much. It's really great to see that there's so many different people from different parts of their career. You know, that it was very exciting for me as an editor, especially to find like there was a mixture of people who were established, that I had read their work in other places and I sought them out. And then the open call just brought in so much talent that it was a really pleasant experience to edit this book, for sure. Instead of starting with like going off from one question to another, were any of the questions that you, like, I did actually give questions to the panelists to kind of get us warmed up first. Um, I just wanted to ask the panelists, like, was there a question that you really were excited to share your answers with to get us started?
I can kick that off.
All right.
I really liked your question. How do you see the role of the writer? I will say when I first read the question, I was stumped. I was like, oh, okay, this is where these are big questions. But the more I thought about it, I think, as you know, I was reading like just books I've read in life and all in the anthology, which I'm trying to hold up to the screen. I thought the role that I think a lot of us took while writing these stories is it after every story, I had to sit and reflect a lot. Like, this was not an anthology that I could just read in a day. It wasn't something I could just read real quickly. Like, after every story, and some were longer than others, some were like just a few pages, I would just have to sit and like stare at the wall for a little bit and really reflect. And so I think the role of a writer, especially, you know, a good writer, it's like drives people or influences or inspires people to think, to reflect, to question the status quo, to make people feel less alone. I think by telling stories, we can feel a little more humanized. And yeah, these are just some initial thoughts I had.
I
Anyone wanna
agree
jump
with
in?
that. Oh, I'm
Layla?
sorry. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think that's a really good point, Rana, about like writing making us feel less alone. I had trouble with this question too, because I often try to think of my role as a writer like in the grand scheme of things, and it's hard not to feel like sometimes hopeless with all you have is words. At the same time, with writers, like, I don't want to lionize what we do and say that we're like saving the world with our words. So it's like a weird kind of balance that you're trying to strike. And as an individual writer, it's hard to say like what my role is, but as a collective of Palestinians, I think at the very basis, our role of transcribing our words, whether that's in poetry or essays or speculative fiction stories, like that at the very basis is the role. It's the transcribing of Palestinian voices on the page for prosperity, right? So that's how I see it. And for writing, like for myself, it's the best way for me to express myself, but also like at the end of the day, every word we write counters the mainstream narrative about us. And I think that's also one way to approach it, especially as somebody who used to be a journalist and who knows how that side works. With our fiction, I think that's what we're doing and what we should keep doing as well.
Layla, I think you had something to say. Oh, we got a lot of people. Wow. Okay.
No, that's great. Well, I was going to say I agree with what Rana had to say, and I did and ask Samah what she had to say as well. Over this year, I've been thinking more about how we are also at this time archivists in the way. Like I'm always thinking futuristically, but we also need to be documenting right now, documenting our feelings, documenting our experiences, and I think that's probably a role a writer is always playing, but I think I'm more aware of it right now, and I tend to think about the past as well. I'm also a historian, but I, teach writing, so it's weird, but so I'm always like in this sort of back and forth phase, but so I think it's archiving and observing and sharing this moment at this time.
Jumaana?
I think Ziyad had his hand up before me if he wants to go first.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Sure,
I know
thank
it's
you.
kind of hard to, yeah.
No worries, no worries. So I agree with everything that's been said, and I would add, one thing that we do when we write is we assert our place in this world. And the more stories we write, the more we assert these identities. And in a way, it's sort of like there's a procreative quality to it, in that every story we write will inspire the next generation to write their own stories. And so it's just, one long chain of stories that let people know we were here. So as long as you write, you exist. And in a world that is determined to erase our existence, that makes the role of the writer all the more important.
I love what everyone's saying about like maintaining present existence and the archival presence as well. And this question actually made me think in terms of like speculative fiction and Palestinian speculative fiction in particular. What Edward Said, who was not only a Palestinian luminary, but just a global luminary, said about how colonial projects and political projects begin in the imagination. And you see that in the history of Zionism. Before the Zionist presence in Palestine, there was Zionist poetry, which imagined it as a place without a land without a people, for a people without a land, and the land of milk and honey, etc. But you also see it in radical movements, in radical literature. I'm thinking of Ursula K. Le Guin, the ability to imagine something, ability to imagine futurity and something completely reconstructing the current modes of existence. That's actual, real political power. So as much as like I agree, we don't want to lionize writing, it does also possess the ability to create something in the imagination before it exists in reality.
Elise, did you have something to say? Your hand is up.
Yes. Just waiting my turn, being polite. I think just to chime in and add, I think exactly what Jumaana was saying about imagination being a place where so many things start. Imagining, writing stories of hope and healing, and even courageous alternatives to things that are dismal, hopeless, and broken. We can imagine how it could have been done differently. We can imagine how it would be done differently in a different time with people behaving in different ways, saying different things. That can be enormously healing to the general, the global imagination, right? What if it was like this?
Emad, did you have something to say?
Sorry. Hassan Kanafani, he invented the word resistance literature, contributed it to the world of literature. And amazing enough, most people think resistance literature is, account of guerrilla operations or things like that. He just meant writing literature itself as a form of resistance. And he was talking specifically about the Palestinians inside Israel, the 1948 Palestinians, maintaining their identity just by describing themselves and talking about themselves and maintaining their family values, sense of identity. And I just posted the link. Author friend, an Egyptian, also said, if you write, that's resistance. You're proving that you exist just by the act of writing. Never mind science fiction. And science fiction is making the impossible possible.
Yeah, I think just to chime in on that as well, especially with science fiction, I feel like, we're kind of writing about possibilities, writing about the future, kind of imagining something that could be different, but it's still very informed by the present. Like when I'm watching the news, my emotions are drained. I'm just seeing horrible things. Like writing is an outlet for me as well, like to channel my grief. Like sometimes my writing is very dark and very much reflects the present, but there's also that, defiance and that hope of, things that could have been. And, I kind of see that as the role of the writer, like both reflecting the present, reflecting, kind of the present consciousness in a way, and also kind of looking to the future. I don't think like there's been a lot of discourse I've noticed online about, the dehumanization of Palestinians and how as writers we're helping humanize Palestinians. And I don't think that should be our role. Like, it should not be our obligation to make people see us as human. I think it's an output of telling our like many diverse stories. But you know, I just write for I write what I wanted to have read when I was younger. You know, like growing up, I loved sci-fi, but there weren't a lot of Arab voices, if any. There weren't even a lot of, you know, women writers. It just felt like men kind of dominated a lot of the classics, even though we had Octavia Butler and Ursula Le Guin. But I also write for, you know, people like me and stories I would have wanted to have read.
This is really refreshing to me. I've read a lot of very pessimistic things recently about the writer and like what we can do in the time of genocide. It seems so there's that tension. I think Samah, you were talking about like the balance that you have to strike between hope and the reality that we're facing right now. And I love that tension. It reminds me of The Secret Life of Said the Pessimist, and that whole idea of the pessimist, you know, that you're pessimistic and you're optimistic at the same time. And I think that's like such a really good Palestinian term, you know, because you're always like trying to, I think everybody pretty much has said something about like the hopefulness of being able to resist through literature. And I think that's really a beautiful thing. Is there any other, like, did you want to make any comments about like specifically fantasy and science fiction writing? Was there anything there that we wanted to follow up on before we go on to the next question? Are we ready to go? Looks like we're ready to go. Okay.
Sorry, I had just one more thing to add.
Oh, sure.
Based on what Nadia was saying about humanizing ourselves and kind of not kind of falling into that trap. And I agree with that, because a lot of times, because we've been so dehumanized for so long, we think we need to put like a special effort into humanizing ourselves, which is A, degrading, and B, is not going to lead to very good storytelling, in my opinion, because usually what happens there is we try so hard to humanize ourselves that we end up sanitizing ourselves, and we're like, the characters become like these, you know, perfect, you know, fathers and mothers who never fight with their kids and never fight with their spouses and have these like illustrious jobs, and they're these like pillars of their communities, and their biggest flaws, like they work too hard and they're just too nice. And it's, you know, nobody's like that, obviously. And so it's just not something, it's like we're writing for the oppressor. We're writing to prove ourselves, our worth to the people oppressing us. And so it's important not to kind of fall into that trap and think about, how do I humanize myself? Because you are human and that's just going to come naturally. So that's something, that was an important point that I thought was brought up.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of that kind of trap that we can fall into, where there's been discourse in the reading community about representation and like having good representation. What does good representation look like for Palestinians? It's like there are books which are attacked because they are a little bit too real, a little bit too messy, and they're labeled as like bad representation of Palestinians. But it's a real representation of like living people, you know, that we're creating. So anybody, Rana, you had a question?
Yeah. I just want to hop on there too. So while I agree that we shouldn't have to humanize ourselves, we're just, especially us living in the diaspora, like I think we've all seen that we kind of need to. And I agree that it's so like we shouldn't have to. We are clearly human, but the way Western propaganda, you know, depicts Palestinians, and a lot of times we're just numbers, or we're like a monolith, right? We're all savages, or we're all the Arabs, or whatever it is. I do agree about not falling into the trap. I think being messy is part of being human, though. So, and not to like just talk about my own story, but sort of intentionally in my story, my character is a bully she's still a person. Like it doesn't make her any less of a human, you know? So I also think on that same note, and I really like that, Sonia, you acknowledged in the preface that the time that we were compiling this anthology is a very different time than we're in now. And I think if you had asked me a year or two ago what the role of the writer is, my perspective has changed so much, where my entire life as a Palestinian American, you know, I've lived most of my life here in the US. I have lived in Palestine as well, but most of my life I've lived here, and I've always felt very invisible as a Palestinian. Like I'm very often the only Palestinian in a room. I'm sure other people have experienced this too, where I remember when we moved here to the US and people would ask, where are you from? And I would say Palestine. I'd get, oh, Pakistan, or like some variation of that. Right. Yeah. I'm seeing people nodding. Like we've all heard some variation of that, or where, or if it's really unfortunate, oh, Israel. It's like, okay. So I viewed my role as a writer, like almost as a patriotic duty to Palestine. Like I need to use whatever feelings and thoughts and ideas I have to make space for us. Like we exist, we're here, and we're loud, and we will not be quiet. And in the world we're living in now, with the genocide that's been going on since last year, we've become a little more known. I don't know if it changes our role entirely. We still have to show the world that we're not just numbers, and it's so unfortunate. But I totally see the point of we shouldn't have to humanize ourselves. But I guess I feel like with Western propaganda, we are forced to. I don't know if that explains what I mean by that, but yeah.
Yeah, I see that. Yeah. I know I did actually mention in the preface too that I wanted to, I agree with Ziyad and like the trap, you know, that I didn't want you guys to fall into that trap. So Jumaana?
Yeah, I mean, I love what both of you are saying, and I agree, Ziyad. Part of that trap also is that we're expected, I think, to expound our trauma, to spill our guts, for, like sometimes literally, as a shortcut for global compassion, rather than having to exert the effort of getting to know us, to translate our experiences, to have conversation, which is a beautiful labor, rewarding labor. People want to see a picture of us bleeding. People want to see a picture of dead children as a shortcut to feeling compassion and sympathy and to humanize us. And something that's become like the mission of my writing life, and it's perhaps more evident in my novel than in this short story, but I think what's still in there is that I just want to afford my characters, particularly the Palestinian ones, the dignity of privacy and ambiguity that I wish Palestinians in Palestine right now had. And when I open the news and I see them filming their dead family members, I just wish the second grief that I have is that they have to show us, that they feel that they have to show us. So for me, like a huge thing for my characters is that I want to give them back that dignity of not, whenever someone pushes them to explain themselves in a way that would be painful, for them to say, no, find some other way to love me, find some other way to understand me and respect me. So I really understand like that trap, and I think it has multiple different ways that we're getting sort of like education extracted out of us at the expense of actual creative excellence and actual imagination.
Layla?
Yeah, you know, I made a connection to something Emad said that I'm pretty sure we've Emad and I have talked about before, and maybe Ahmed Almadi, who is actually logged in, an Egyptian fantasy sci-fi writer. But sci-fi can also be a form of resistance literature. And it's not just about hope. Sometimes it can be a way to articulate ideas that if you said them straight out, you know, people might, you know, there might be backlash, but if you put it within the realm of a futuristic sci-fi story that somewhere out in the world people are doing these things, it can articulate new ideas that are a form of resistance. And the point I want to make, it's not just for Palestine, but other Arab, other Arabs in the region as well, in terms of sci-fi. So I think it's playing a big role for Palestinians, but also others in the region.
Sorry about that. My mother calling. She's in a nursing home. She's doing a lot better. She was in the hospital for a while. So, Elise?
I think Emad had his hand raised. Was that right?
Yeah. I don't know how to do the thing where I put my hand up. Sorry.
Right.
I was and we have sanitized accounts of the Palestinian, that's true, but we also have the opposite, where you have people who love to air their dirty laundry and make themselves feel guilty. I was reading a book once on the countryside in Arabic literature, a book in Arabic, and an interesting historical factoid popped up in the chapter on Palestine. That in Palestinian history, there were these people who came to the country, I think from Arabia, and they basically became brigands that extorted money out of the peasants, especially that tried to transport their agricultural produce from village to village or village to the town. And interesting enough, something like that existed in Egypt. Muhammad Ali, when he came to power, he gave those people who are living up in the mountains land rights, and the process they became the local landed gentry and began investing in agriculture in the countryside. He bought them off, so to speak, by actually making them legitimate. They became the local Onda, the elites. And to me, science fiction, it's like sociology. You're slicing up a society into its component parts and figure out how they interact with each other and how you can push things in a predatory fashion or a positive, mutually beneficial fashion. And wouldn't you know it, I was attending a history conference once on the Ottoman Empire, and they mentioned Palestine. And they're talking about how the Ottomans collected taxes, and they did an auction where people would offer their services as to who could get more taxes out of the peasants. How embarrassing that is. So I used that, I turned that upside down in a short story, unpublished short story, where you have auctions where the person who can reduce taxes the most gets wins the auction. Because that's good for the economy and good for the people, because if you don't have predatory taxation, people invest more. So I mean, the whole thing about retrofuturism, you can take a tiny little element from the past and build a word around it, and in a positive way, where you turn it upside down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Rasha Al-Dawhari had a whole essay in the issue for Strange Horizons, where she talked about Palestine as a futurism. I really feel like we talked about a lot of futuristic things right now. I wanted to, Elise, if you wanted to just wrap up the question that we've been talking about, and then we'll move on.
Yes, I wanted to follow up and agree, especially with what Layla said about science fiction allowing us to bypass biases and assumptions and get at some really interesting questions and issues without necessarily bringing up people's defenses and getting past them and getting to those ideas. I think that is one of the coolest things science fiction allows us to do as writers. That's what I had to say.
Excellent. Okay, I thought we really were kind of segueing really nicely into the question about the work that a writer can do to create future Palestines. And I know this was a question that kind of, again, was a bit of a big question. And I'm thinking in terms of the role of the writer, so it does actually kind of relate a little bit, but I wanted to kind of see what you had to say about the getting right into our maybe patriotic duty, as Rana said, to or to humanize or not to humanize the tension there, the pessimism, the optimism. Layla?
I think for me, it's something that Sonia, I've noticed you do too, which is you know, dig into some research. I mean, we have all our family stories. We have all the books on recent history, but it's really fascinating to get kind of into the weeds, so to speak, on different things, whether it's you know, environmental histories, you know, plant life in the region, or just folklore, etc. So I think that's a way of keeping things alive, and it echoes what we just said. I think, was it Emad just now who said, you know, you take that core of the past, which is something we all, of course, are looking at, you know. How can you take that core of the past, understand it fully, and bring it forward into what it should be and what it could be in the future?
I think that ties in really well with your short story, Sonia. Like, you spoke about breadcrumbs, like the breadcrumbs that are left from our ancestors and the breadcrumbs that we leave. Like, without the stories of my grandmothers and grandfathers, I wouldn't be here today writing these stories. So the breadcrumbs that they left for me and the pieces of history that they left for me is what enabled me now to imagine a future. It's all like a through line that goes from the past to the present to the future, which also your forward is like to Palestine, past, present, and future. I think that ties in very nicely. We're always writing to go back to Palestine, you know? Like, that's what our writing, I feel like it does. Like, every time we write a word for Palestine, it's like our way of going back before we physically can go back. Through our words, we go back. And that's how we imagine our futures, for me anyway. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Nadia.
Yeah, I wanted to piggyback on that idea of like going back to the past, because like I'm the same way whenever I write about, you know, I write a Palestinian story. There's often a grandmother in there and grandparents, because that's what I grew up with. My grandma, you know, my teta telling stories about her life in Jerusalem, about fleeing. She got expelled twice, once in 48 and once again in the 60s. And, you know, I grew up with her cooking and her stories, but you know, there's that kind of tension between kind of going back to the past, but also trying to decolonize and kind of imagine a future. And like, I think when we talk about decolonization, it's not just about like this kind of nostalgic, you know, let's go back to, you know, 1946. It's about, you know, moving onward, moving on to something different and imagining something, you know, I don't know if I want to say better, but, you know, evolving beyond the past.
I think an interesting, like, not to mention Edward Said again, but one thing he mentioned about the function of Orientalism is to restrict Arab cultures to the past only. And so I find it like really interesting how we're resisting by taking the past and actually moving it into the future as well, so that we're not just some civilization that exists static in the past and is unable to evolve and incapable of imagination outside of the Western imagination imposed upon us. But I feel what you guys are all saying in my own short story in the anthology, Down Under. It's literally two Australian girls physically digging their way back to Palestine, because that's the only way that they are able to access that land. At the time, I wasn't thinking about the other kinds of tunnels that soon became the mainstay of the news cycle. But but I found that metaphor quite poignant, and somehow just like struck me as like, I feel like that's what I'm doing. Like, I'm digging back to something that I don't know, because part of the Zionist project has been to give me this forced amnesia. And there's this John Foster Dulles quote, which I think has been attributed to different people as well, that with regards to the Palestinians, the older people will die and the younger people will forget. So just the act of remembering is resistance, but not only to remember, but to think forward is just this huge, I think it probably strikes terror into the hearts of people who wish that we didn't exist in the first place.
this whole discussion is like really refreshing to me. Like I feel so privileged to be here and listening to you all. Is that Ziyad?
Yeah, and I was just going to add that writing science fiction or speculative fiction in a way for me is a promise that we are going to move forward, and it's just a matter of how. And I think even if you have kind of like this dystopian future story, it's it will it is still very much a promise that we are going to get past this point, and whether it's you know, in one direction or another, um, we will still be here. That is kind of the promise we make when we write the story. And I think that in itself is important.
Yeah, I feel like the question that I had posed about how this actually was a question that someone on Twitter had suggested when I asked for some feedback about what they were interested in hearing from you. And one of them was that they wanted to know about how you treat emotion and relationships in your story. And I feel like so much of what we've been saying has been about hope and grief, mourning, and also like imagining and promising a future. So I just wanted to kind of jump over to that question and see what how we can kind of weave those threads into this discussion about like the future Palestines, if you wanted to, or if you can talk like granularly about your story as well if you want.
I love emotions so much, and all of my stories are wildly emotional. So I would be happy to kick this off. In Remembrance and Cerulean, my story, emotions are both the impetus and the blockade toward what my character needs to do or has to do. There's pain and shame that holds him back, and there's compassion that pushes him forward. In this case, in a friendship to an alien race that's been incredibly maltreated by the humans in his society. And those relationships are what create the networks that connect and change us. So I think that emotions can be just beautiful, beautiful tools for both changing and pushing the characters to also change and develop their stories.
Yeah, I'll go next. Oh, sorry, Ziyad, go for it.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess like for me, I mean, emotions, relationships, I mean, they're critical to any story. It doesn't matter if it's, in far off space with, spaceships and all of that. Like, I think it as a reader, if you're not connecting with the characters and if it lacks heart, you just have a story with cool action and cool world building. So, it's the heart of everything I think we do as writers, is getting to that emotional core. I feel like with Palestinian stories, especially, like our culture has such strong, like, emphasis on family and strong family ties. So those relationships are really key, and emotion, especially, I've always felt it's something that's kind of weaponized against Palestinians in particular. Like, when I was younger and I'd be talking to people here in the West, or even engaging with like a Zionist person, I always had this consciousness of like, I have to be very careful with my emotions. I always have to appear calm and appear reasonable. Like, I'm not allowed to get angry or righteous the way that, the way that other people can get angry and righteous. I always have to, or else I'll become the angry Arab. So I think within fiction, I kind of like to let some of that out a bit, like, let the characters feel all the things and express all the things, and, use that to drive plot forward.
Get messy.
Get messy. I feel like that's part of the theme of this panel.
Yeah.
So my story is kind of different in that it's not very emotional. It's actually quite detached. And that is how I often write, not always, but oftentimes, because when I see the news, one of the only things that, keeps me going is to really try to detach myself from what I'm seeing. Because if I really kind of invest too much in it, I don't know if I'll make it through the day. And I think that's, it's something that does concern me, and concerns me in part because I think um, it will lead to the desensitization of, people are just of just society in general when they see these things. And so, in my story, the way I describe everything, it's kind of just very casual, almost apathetic. Um, and that kind of ties into the idea of speculative fiction, because that is also one of the possibilities, is that we are just going to become so numb and casual when we talk about these things. And that to me is, one of the most terrifying scenarios, especially because I'm already starting to see it happening now.
Where people just tune out once they see the evidence of atrocity. They don't know what to do with it, and so they just numb themselves.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of not uncommon among diaspora Palestinians, because we feel like we often feel like we're very helpless and we can't do anything. And so we kind of just try to distance ourselves emotionally, to kind of match this sort of physical distance that we feel from Palestine.
Yeah, I mean, even if somebody asks us how we're doing right now, what do we say? It's a question that so many people I know have been saying, like, I don't know how to talk to people anymore. You can't just say like, oh, I'm good.
I mean, earlier I said I'm alive.
I'm alive. Yeah. I was
alive.
about to say that. Yeah, I'm alive. That's
early on. I used to just tell people like, I'm Palestinian.
Yeah.
What do you want me to say? And I'm sorry, Rana, you had something to say as well.
Oh, no worries. I'm totally enjoying this conversation because I agree. I don't, sometimes I don't know what to say either, but I really like what Ziyad was saying about his story being so detached, and it was such a different approach than what I took in my story, because despite Ziyad, your story being so detached that it was haunting, it really resonated with me. It was like it still had a level of emotions in there that I thought about it for a really long time. The way I am as a reader, and so I tried to bring this into my own writing, is the feelings will resonate with me more so than the plot. So I could absolutely tell you like, oh, this book I read 2 years ago, it's like my favorite book. Couldn't tell you a single thing that happened, but I cried. Like, I don't know if anyone else is like that too. Couldn't tell you a single character's name, but I cried. It's my favorite book. And so in my story, I wanted to bring in a lot of feelings. And so without like rehashing the whole plot, but my main character is a bully. She's not really thinking about other people's perspectives, and she is kind of forced. She has a curse put on her, and she's forced to hop into other people's bodies and live their lives briefly. And it's forced empathy, and she realizes all these people have complex, messy, complicated, nuanced lives that she had never even considered. And she herself is dealing with grief, and I wanted to bring in all those feelings that are so relatable on a human level that aren't, despite the story taking place in Palestine, it's not specific to Palestine. We've all been through grief. We've all had people who tease us in school or whatever. We have like a quiz that we're nervous about. We have, all these things that are just so relatable that, again, makes the characters very real, as opposed to just a vehicle for the plot to move forward. So that's kind of how I was trying to put emotion in my story. The other thing I wanted to add too, kind of also to piggyback off of what other people were saying, that a lot of Palestinian stories are so like painful, and rightfully so. And so while I think that's so important to convey that, I also tried to put some humor, a little bit of a couple of lighter moments in my story too, because sometimes when a story is so painful, it's hard to get through. And if you want to get the story across, you need the person to read it all. So I tried to put a little bit, so I was trying to think of a balance there between like the raw feelings, and also like, you know, my main character is 12 and sometimes she says silly things.
Yeah, I think a lot of the stories, to me as the editor, felt very intimate. So there was like, I could see the rhyming that was going on with Palestine, and then also how it was very personal at the same time. So the politics and the personal kind of being entwined in so many of the stories that we had that came in. And so I really like that this question came up, because we can kind of talk about some of those layers. Did you have something to say, Emad?
Well, yeah.
I thought I saw you.
Yeah. I didn't put my hand up, but I was thinking what
Oh.
to say, what I could possibly contribute after all these
spot.
things. Again, Ghassan Kanafani has a very nice novella called I think عن الرجل والبندقية, about the man and the gun, and it's set in the. This young man is going up into the mountains to attack a English fort at the time, the British Mandate, and he's heard that there's a rebellion happening there. He goes up there, there's no rebellion, and he finds a bunch of other people who also heard rumor of a rebellion. He said, but as long as we're here and we're armed, let's do a rebellion. And he had to borrow, he couldn't get money from his father to buy a rifle, so he had to borrow an old Ottoman musket from his uncle. And his father, when he saw his son doing this, he got jealous, so he wanted borrowed money from a moneylender to get a proper rifle and go up there as well. And it's really funny, as well as giving you very accurate and embarrassing details about how Palestine was organized at the time, and the economy, and shady things happening in the background. So, I mean, what I've discovered reading Ghassan Kanafani is my sense of humor is actually Palestinian. All this time I thought I had the dry British sense of humor. It's actually Palestinian, cynical, and very objective at the same time. And of course, Ghassan Kanafani also has his famous book about al-Ashq. He's a great lover. He was a romantic at heart, very gentle and sweet person. And I've also discovered that about myself. I'm a romantic. I've always thought of myself as a practical person, a scientific person, a rational. Again, this sort of Englishy upbringing, but it turns out I'm a romantic at heart. And it comes out in my stories, and it gives it energy. You want, you have to love what you're doing and be passionate about it. You can be passionate in a bad way, hate something, but that could really drains you. But if there's love, there's hope at the end of it. And that's what happens in my story in Thyme Travellers, the time travel story, where this guy goes backwards in time for the sake of his sweetheart. It's kind of a, like a, not a wedding gift, but to tell her how much he loves her, so he can ask for her hand. And he ends up messing everything up for her and for his people as well. So he has to go back and undo what he did.
Yeah, I do get that Palestinian sense of humor. The Secret Life of Said the Pesoptimist is like that a lot. That there's he's a collaborator with the Israelis, and it's, you still love him even though he's just a total coward. But he there's, for example, there's a scene where his wife, whose name is Remain, she is listening to him, and he's been charged with the Israelis to undermine communist sympathies in the villages, Palestinian villages. And she says, well, who are communists? I've never heard of communists before. And so he says, oh, they're rascals who they don't believe in the blessing that the conqueror gives to the conquered people, and they think they can change fate, and they're just ridiculous. And so she says, we need to join up with the communists. And so it just like ruins his whole life, he ends up in jail. You know, it's just it's so funny. But a lot of people that I tell these little snippets to, they're like, how is that funny though? But it's that kind of twisted, like optimistic, pessimistic humor.
I think it's like this remnant maybe of like existential absurdity, which I've seen in, for example, the films of Layla Sulaiman, which are so funny. There's this one clip in Divine Intervention where this Palestinian man is just like happily eating a peach, driving along, and it's just a close up on him. He finishes the peach and he looks at the pit and he just like throws it out the window, and it zooms out and the pit hits a tank which immediately explodes. And I think there's this like humor of like, he wasn't meant to be alive enjoying that beautiful apricot according to the tank that existed there. So that just little action of him driving happily eating an apricot causes this like is a form of like resistance and rebellion in Elise Sulaiman's sense of humor. And you see that sort of absurdity of existence in Mahmoud Darwish's poetry as well. And I think that like matter-of-factness about insane things reflects the insanity of life in occupied Palestine sometimes, and of what we're witnessing as well. And I had a little bit of that in my short story, which is perhaps less overtly humorous, but everyone sort of accepts the fact that, oh yeah, of course, the only way to get to Palestine is to dig a hole in the ground and dig yourself all the way there. And no one really questions it because of that just acceptance of, oh yeah, this is the point that we're at right now.
It's just to kind of get back to the emotional aspect of it. I want to piggyback on what Nadia had said before about writing stories that you wish you saw when you were younger. And when I wrote Gaza Luna, which is about a little boy who like dreams, his ultimate dream is to go to the moon. That's sort of what I was setting out to do. I wanted something that my nephews and nieces could read, and that it wouldn't be like, you know, too traumatic for them. There is a slice of reality and there's tragicness in the way that it begins, but the story ends in like a larger than life fashion with Handla being able to go to the moon and to like let go of all of the Palestinian flags. And that little part about like not seeing the Palestinian flags throughout the whole story to building up to the end where he just releases all of the Palestinian flags into the cosmos. There's a bit of humor in there. I mean, like I'm kind of laughing at the fact that we are so censored and like we have to use watermelons as symbols and we can't even show our flags, that this boy went all the way to the moon just to be able to plant the flag and be like, you cannot take this away from me. So there is a humorous aspect in the tragedy of it all. Emotionally speaking, Handala is very much in his head. Like they call him a space cadet. And it's a bit how I was when I was a kid. I think a lot of Palestinian kids, especially in the diaspora, are in their head when it comes to their own identity and questions of place and where they fit. So I wanted to kind of express that also in this little kid. And the final thing that I really wanted to show was like the passage of time. So there's a long, like I'm talking about a story from when he's a child to when he has to leave his hometown, growing up, going through like all of that, and then coming back to Palestine. That coming back to Palestine was important to me because the biggest relationship for Handala in this story is his relationship to place, like to land, and how he reacts to being extracted from his home place and then put back in it 15 years later and seeing that it actually hasn't really changed it. It actually might be worse. He came back to like a worse situation, not necessarily better. It's not always roses. But also the fact that when he does go back home, he feels as if though he never left. Like his family is still very much his family. His neighbors take him in immediately. And I don't know how many of you have been lucky enough to actually like go to Palestine. But this is my experience. When I went back to Gaza as a kid, my family like treated like I was part of the family immediately. Like it wasn't even, you know, it wasn't even a question. It wasn't like, who is he? I immediately felt part, like I was home as a kid, and something I never felt growing up because I didn't grow up around my cousins and aunts and uncles. They were all in Gaza. So when I did have the opportunity to go back and just how quickly I felt at home, I wanted to kind of convey that as well through this short story in that way.
Yeah, I've never been to Palestine, but my family live in Jordan now. And when I visited them as a kid, the like entire extended family, like the whole village showed up at the airport. And then I was sort of like, I remember feeling I was maybe 6 or 7. And I remember feeling like, oh, well, I guess I live here now, and feeling very much at home. Um, did anybody else want to talk about their particular story and maybe some craft issues? Layla?
Craft issues as well, or
Sure,
yeah.
whatever you have.
Well, first, just what I was going to say. I echo what Samah just said about, I think the story in this anthology is about relationship to land. And actually, the two characters in the story are actually my father and grandmother. Because one saying my dad always said was, no one can hold that land, but the Palestinians are still going to be there, when this is all over. And I see that as futuristic too.
Mhm.
Because yeah, if you look back in history, you had every empire coming and going, but people stayed. But on two other scales, one, I do write very emotionally, and I've expended a lot of ink and digital text trying to define, I think, my emotions of living in the diaspora and living in this in-between state. So I do try to insert that through metaphor, simile, sometimes direct statements, depending on, how I'm shaping the piece. And I also think sort of in the multi-dimensional sort of space, and something that I think about all the time. I live in Missouri, and there are ancient mounds of, the first peoples all around, over in East St. Louis too, and especially East St. Louis. And I just always think that, just sitting in my backyard, I mean, those spirits are still walking through just around here. So I was trying to represent that as well, as that sense of being, of one time being in a place, and that relationship doesn't end, even if the people, have passed on. So, you know.
Hey, Nadia?
Yeah, I think talking about writer's craft, like two things I do with pretty much everything I write, whether it's a novel or a short story, is have a what if, and that's kind of the sci-fi element, what if this technology existed or this premise could happen, and then the character's journey. You have a character who starts in one place, and then the events of the story get thrown at them, and then their goal changes, their values change, something gets challenged in them. But I think talking about my story in the anthology, The Generation Ship, it was inspired by my grandparents, and my jiddo, after he passed away, went to his house in Saudi Arabia, and we were going through his old things. And I, learned things I didn't know before. Like he worked for the British Mandate before, the Nakba happened. He was like a desk kind of clerk for the British government. And of course, the Nakba happened, and he was supposed to get a pension. And he wrote to the British government for years afterwards, asking about his pension. And of course, they never responded to him. So we found these very old letters, like worn down paper, and, old photographs of life in Jerusalem and all that. And it made me think, what if instead of passing down possessions, we could pass down memories after we die? Like, you could have a will and I'm going to give this person my memories. I'm going to give this person like my favorite dream. And so that's kind of the what if premise of the book, being able to pass down literal memory, down to your family. And then I think the conflict comes from what the family does with it. You have the main character who's very Americanized and very westernized and doesn't really feel Palestinian enough, and also kind of not good enough based on, the standards of the family. He's not an engineer or a doctor, a high performer, but he develops that connection to his identity and to his family's past through those memories and kind of learning new things about family. So that's kind of my craft advice. What if, and where does the character need to go?
Yeah, it's really central to like all the speculative fiction is like I think one author called it a X factor that you throw in there. You kind of tweak reality a little bit to see what happens. Did anybody have any thoughts about genre? Because we had kind of been talking around genre a little bit, and it's a part of craft, I think. And to me, it's like what I'm getting from this conversation is there's so much that's not dystopian, surprisingly, because like as a curator of Palestinian speculative fiction, it's predominantly dystopian when you look at the works that are produced, especially recently. So this is really refreshing, and I keep saying that, but it's true. Like it's like a balancing of the scales a little bit. And I think one of the things that I, as a writer, am wary of is the publishing industry's inclination to trauma and trying to mine trauma from colonized peoples. And we had kind of touched a little bit on that when we talked about humanizing, right? Now, one of my next project is going to be, I know many of you already know about this, but there's a book that's going to be coming out from Fernwood, which is a book of Palestinian dark fiction, horror, and dark fantasy. And some of the feedback that I got from some people I reached out to was that they usually see a kind of hopefulness in their narratives. And I can see like a hopefulness in dystopian and in works that deal with trauma, because it also shows survival, right? So when you think about your own works or like your positionality as a writer, how do you relate to genre when it comes to writer's craft? And I didn't prepare you for this at all. Ziyad?
Yeah, so just I mean, one thing in terms of hope, I think it's important to note that, speculative fantasy sci-fi shows the possibilities of what can happen to us, but it shows us also the possibilities of what we can do. So there is this sort of not just hope, but self-assertion that is often lacking in stories that are told about us from outside our community. So I think, in terms of craft, I think approaching a story from that mentality of not just what the problems are going to be for us down the line, but also what we can do to solve those problems. And once you kind of have that, I mean, that's basically your premise, your climax, your resolution right there.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Layla?
Yeah, in terms of my own plans, once I have an idea sketched out and I write a few things out, I do start thinking in terms of how you know, what are the structures used in different genres? And how is my draft working? How might it change? You know, and sometimes I have to have another reader. I had a nonfiction, creative nonfiction essay I wrote once and could not get the rhythm. And sometimes it does take someone else reading it to say, oh, I see where the core of this is, you know. But I don't let it overwhelm me, but I do try to give some consideration, not in terms of how a publisher might receive it, but just how am I articulating my ideas? You know, would this work best as having a romantic undertone or a dystopian undertone? You know, just some ideas.
Yeah. Like where the
Think-
story is, where what the story wants to go.
Yeah. But
For me, genre. Oh, sorry, Layla, you continue, please.
I was just going to add, but I do think it's helpful to recognize what's going on in your rough draft. You know, like get it all written and don't listen to all the critics in your head. But then maybe step back and say, how is it working? So that's all I wanted to say.
Genre has been a bit of an issue for me in my short stories and also in my novel, I think, because I sometimes sit between genres or the recognized Western genres anyway, but I do enjoy a little bit of a heightened aspect to even to my more realistic stories. So I think it's easy for me to slip into spec fic. But I think about writers like Toni Morrison, who used something I think is better described as like spiritual realism. And I also see a lot of speculative fiction being utilized by the First Nations writers in Australia so brilliantly because they also have that element of spiritual realism that they understand that these sort of supernatural or less like factual aspects to their story are real to them because that is part of their inheritance in dream telling, etc. And I feel that in not only my Arab heritage, but my Islamic heritage as well. I think, use for crafting particularly short stories, this maybe medical framework of having a hypothesis and having almost a vindictive experiment where I start off with a question, sometimes in a logical question and a logical premise, and I try and follow it as, you know, as determinedly, as doggedly as I can to its logical end. And that drives the characters along. And often what I think sustains my stories is not necessarily like a hero's journey kind of conflict or tension, but the mystery of another human being and these the constant tension of wanting something from someone else or someone else wanting something from the main character in that scene and trying to throughout the story, throughout this like continuous succession of illogical things, pushing and grading against each other to arrive at, usually I like to end on a climax, particularly with short stories, because I want it to be a slightly punchier pill than a novel. So that's how I don't know, I maybe straddle genres a little bit, and it has made it a bit hard for me in the American, trying to penetrate the American market because of, I think maybe you guys want something a little bit easier to put on the shelf. But it's, for me, that's what's more interesting.
Elise?
Sonia, I know I was one of the people who immediately wrote back and said, something dark, but I write hopeful stuff. How do you want something? I don't know if I can do this. I identify so much with intentionally writing stories that are hopeful or redemptive, or at least have some thread of healing in them. And the way I've been able to somewhat reconcile myself with, you know, dark fantasy or horror is, I know I can't write a story and then say, then make it darker. That's not going to work at all. That's going to create a terrible story. But what I can do is make my central problem and challenge that my characters are going through to be something that is harrowing, traumatic, dark, something that brings them right to the verge of losing their grip on on hope, on believing that things could still work out and having them fight through that. It will then color every part of the story. I can tell the story I want to tell. I just have to make the obstacle or the central conflict something that carries all the notes of the genre I need it to.
It kind of weaves the thread back to what we were talking about with emotions and like your work being very emotional, right? And I can see that being a core of like a hypothetical dark fantasy story that you might carry that core from your work into that other genre.
Yes, I find. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No,
Go ahead, Samah.
ahead.
I was going to say it took me months and months, and I finally thought of something dark I could write, Sonia, and that's because of your prompting. So thank you.
I was just going to say I usually write poetry. That's the medium that I'm most published in, and usually with poetry it's like completely different. I write a stream of consciousness, like emotion, and then I edit like there's no tomorrow. And with this specifically, a short story was particularly like challenging because I didn't want it to be just emotions on the page. It had to be like a linear story. And like the first thing the first idea I had was I wanted a Palestinian boy to make it to the moon and to plant the flag. That's like, I started from the ending and I sort of like reverse engineered it to how does this Palestinian boy with this huge dream, how does he get to actually do it? And this is what
like an image.
What's that?
Did you have an image of that came to you?
Yeah, it came to me in my head, and it was like even before they did the recent like bans of the Palestinian flag. I mean, it's always been kind of like in the decades past, like we know the history with the flag and the fact that it's been banned. And growing up in Canada, I never ever saw the Palestinian flag like outside. So that always played on a loop in my head. And I always was wondering like, how can I bring the Palestinian flag to a point where it cannot be ignored? And so that's like, and initially when I first came up with that idea, I thought it would work well as like a short animated like film or something like that, for like really in my mind, it was for Palestinian children to see and feel inspired. So that's where it first came out. So when this prompt came for a short story, I immediately thought of Gaza Luna, and I thought, okay, like I have to turn this into like a short story, and I'm not used to it. So it was a nice challenge to kind of have to go through all of like the beats of a story. Like I've actually written novel-sized like stories before, like but never like a short story. So to condense everything into those beats was quite the challenge. And I do feel like I could have expounded much more on certain things, but at the end of the day, like I said, like to end on a hopeful yet tragic note was kind of like where it was headed. And just to go from like poetry, stream of consciousness, to this, which is like much more prepared, and the rough draft was essential for this. Like I don't know. I know a lot of writers write off the seat of their pants, like they just kind of write and think about it later. For this particular story, I did have to like plan every part of it.
Yeah. Emad, did you have something to add? I'm trying to make sure that I catch your gestures. This is a bit dark.
Yeah. Fortunately, I'm not good at horror and dark fantasy. I'm too much the hard science fiction writer and the social science guy. But something I've noticed observing Arabic science fiction is that we love to blend genres, and in the process, we produce something original. And one of the examples of that in our anthology is the Front Runner by J.D. Harlock. It's a cyberpunk story. It's a very cyberpunk story, but it's also a dark fantasy story. Things about malevolent entities and like the jinn, essentially. And a lot of our science fiction is informed by fantasy. And I think some of the best science fiction is informed by fantasy. And I'm beginning to learn this myself, even in my own writing. And like I said, I'm the hard science fiction guy. So, I give an example concerning genre and genre labels. James Cameron, when he did The Terminator, He was told point blank, what you have done isn't science fiction. Star Wars, that's science fiction. So he said, but what do you mean? This is time travel and robotics, two mainstays of science fiction. So I mean, the publicist is just thinking about pitching the thing and getting an audience. The writer really shouldn't bog himself down in those concerns. He should just write what he likes and what he can relate to, and it'll sort itself out. You'll find a way to pitch it afterwards to keep the publishers happy.
Yeah, there is that question of like genre from the point of view of the writer, and what sort of shape the story takes. It might not be something that you sit down and say, I'm going to be writing a horror story. You just may sit down and you follow the question, or you follow the characters or the setting, and then it takes a certain shape. And then you have the whole process of the industry, right? Where there's categories that they have to sell the book in, or if you're writing short stories like I do, you have to then find a market that's going to fit that story, which I ran into a problem where I think that I may have invented a genre for Palestinian speculative fiction. And so I was like, well, now where am I going to send this to? Because there's very few that I would send a Palestinian speculative fiction story to. And then on top of that, it was such a weird little story. So it was like, okay, it's horror, but none of the horror places want anything to do with spirits. But I have, from Palestinian folklore, I've got ghouls in there. And so it was like, how am I going to find a place for this? So the genre was also like this other like imposed constraint on the work.
Which is why it's awesome to have an opportunity like this to write like completely freely and not have to think about it. I didn't even know I wrote speculative fiction. I didn't know it was a genre like a few years ago, and it was so hard for me to categorize like the type of writing that I did. And it was a Palestinian writer who came to me and said, I think you might be writing speculative. Like it's very much like that. And I think, Sonia, you were also one of those people, and you've said it before, and I quote you all the time, the fact that like all Palestinian writing is speculative to some degree. And
yeah,
I keep that in mind. Yeah. And when I keep that in mind, and when I look back at my writing, it like immediately like kind of made sense. So yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah,
and thanks for the
that's
opportunity for the horror one that's coming up.
Thank you. So nice to me. Yeah, that's something that I forgot who it was that actually started the conversation about the speculative nature of Palestinian fiction, and that all of our literature is speculative. It's something that's fascinating to me, because there's a tension in there as well, because there is this perception that we are liars, that our history is fake, that we are a fake people, that we don't exist, and all of these other things. As a Palestinian who writes from a folklore perspective, I get a lot of comments from people who are saying that, well, this is funny because you don't exist, and all these sort of things. So there's that, like, almost like I don't want to admit that our more like realist modes would have a speculative element to them, because I'm sort of like, I'm worried about our perception, but at the same time, I don't want to have to worry about my perception. I want us to just be, Were there any other comments about craft before we move on to questions from the audience?
Yeah, I had one more thing I wanted to add. One thing I've been thinking about lately is genre as a vehicle to exploring whatever it is, the message that you want to talk about. I think, like I said, like I mentioned earlier, I viewed writing as kind of a patriotic duty almost, or like using that space to talk about Palestine. And so when I've historically thought about writing about Palestine, it's like the default felt like historical fiction. Assuming we're not writing like a history book of facts, you know, if it's a fiction story, historical fiction. But lately I've been thinking a little more about like, you can use romance to talk about Palestine. You can use horror to talk about Palestine. You can use a mystery. It could be a murder mystery. It could be whatever, you know, it could be like the genre can just be the vehicle to explore the world around you. And it's not just to, as we've talked about, like humanizing, it's not just that, but it is, you explore like the culture, like the way that, let's say someone's going to consider a romance story, the way that you approach romance or dating or relationships like in Palestine or as Palestinians with our, you know, with Palestinian culture is going to be very different than a Western like romance story. And that's still a way to like explore the world and make the characters feel real and make the message feel alive. And so I've been thinking a little bit more about genre being kind of the vehicle, kind of the outline of, you know, just the outline as opposed to the substance.
Any other comments to wrap up on craft? No? Okay, I think Art has a speakers list of people who have questions for us. There he is.
Yeah, no, it's not a pre-prepared list, but if we get a lot of hands, I'll
Okay.
order the list, and people can at this time feel free to raise their hand and unmute their mic to ask a question if they have any.
I think we spoke about everything so thoroughly. And maybe nobody
blew
has
their
any
minds.
questions.
We're that good. We're just that good.
Yeah, okay, cool.
But
Yeah.
yeah, I do feel like I've learned so much. I've just been soaking up everything that you've been saying. And it's given me a fresh perspective too, because something I've been looking into recently is world building, and not just fictional world building, but like how we build a future and the role of the author or the writer in that process to encourage people to take action and at the same time imagine some future that's more just, that's a better world. And I think that I've sort of been fed by what you've been discussing, because so much of what I've read of Palestinian speculative fiction outside of our collection has been very much like the future looks bleak, is as bleak or bleaker than our past. And so that bleakness was sort of like very much, I think because it was closer to me, it was obscuring the hopeful elements that you've all brought out to us. So thank you for that. Fazila, I think, has a question.
Yes, thank you so much for this wonderful, it's just so great to hear you all talk about your stories. And Sonia, you're just such a great facilitator, just as you're such a great editor. Thank you so much, everybody. I just wanted to ask about the diasporic element of this book and how you all feel about it, how it came to be. I know some of the answers, but I just thought it would be interesting to talk about with everybody.
I was gonna say, Rana, you were saying earlier, you're usually the only Palestinian in the room, but I think it's so beautiful that there's so many of us in one place. I think what an achievement for us. I'll just quickly speak about my short story because that was a huge focus of the theme, was these two young women who are from sort of opposite ends of the spectrum of the diaspora, and one was born in Palestine and then sent into exile, has a very strong connection with the place politically, emotionally, culturally, and feels it's like her life mission to get back there. Whereas the other young woman, the main character, all she knows is that she has grandparents who were from Palestine and can't speak the language very well, and just feels this impulse to start digging to go back, but isn't really sure where that is coming from. And throughout the story, what I wanted for them was, through the labor of like digging against everything that's stopping them from reaching their birthright, be brought closer together physically in that tiny space underground in the earth, bumping against each other until finally they reach some sort of camaraderie, which once they join in that emotional way, gives them a strength that they didn't have when they were strangers. And I think part of the political power that we have is joining together from all of our disparate places around the world. And we were sent out to be away from each other, to forget each other, to not know each other on purpose. And I think we forget that there was a deliberateness to that act, and actually to come together and to get to know each other despite the difficulties of it is a form of rebellion. And so I wanted to capture that, and also capture the different levels of Palestinianness that I think a couple of us have commented on, and see, do they both have an equal right to that land? And I think the answer that I arrived at was yes, of course.
I love that radical. What is the opposite of alienation, right? Radical
consummation, maybe.
The remembering of our people together, and something that really informed, like, from what I could gather from our conversation, like it's kind of all fitting into my head like Tetris right now, is the way that I forgot my train of thought. I'm sorry. Yeah, I can't remember what I was gonna say, but if I remember, I will pop back in.
I feel like, as Palestinians in the diaspora, our relationship, for many of us, the relationship to Palestine is a speculative one. So the genre is a natural one to orbit, because all we can really do is imagine what it's like, what it's going to be like by the time we finally get there, and imagine how we're going to feel when we're there, because that's also something we don't really know. I mean, a lot of times we think we're going to get there and we're going to be like immediately feeling happy or relieved or hopeful, but I've been wrestling with that recently because I don't know, especially with everything that's going on now. So it's all speculative, and I think that kind of lends a lot of credibility to speculative fiction from Palestinian writers in a
Thank
way
you,
that
Emad, for sorry.
sorry,
Emad,
no.
he popped up in the chat saying that integration is the word I was thinking of.
Ingratiation.
Ingratiation? It just popped up really quickly, so I didn't get to see it. Is it integration or ingratiation?
Ingratiation.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say, I think the on a broader scale, the idea of like an anthology is really important, especially as being Palestinians in the diaspora and being so forcefully historically separated, and from one another, to actually come together in an anthology and have so many diverse voices. And like I think none of us have met each other before, like in real life or anything like that, but the themes that come up, the jokes that are so very Palestinian, like I find like like it's very obvious that this was written by a people. And just I think the medium of anthologies is one that's really interesting for Palestinians at this moment in time. And I'm currently working on a poetry project that's called One Line for Palestine, and it takes this idea to like a new level where I'm crowdsourcing poetry lines from Palestinians. So I've asked Palestinians to send me one line of poetry, and what I'm doing is I'm taking all of these different lines and I'm putting them together into poems by Palestinians, literally taking the voices of Palestinians on the page, putting them on the page, and transcribing them for prosperity. So just this bringing together of different Palestinian voices, whether it's like through a project like what I'm doing or through this anthology and future ones. I just think it's a great way of bringing our writing to just a collectiveness that we desperately need right now.
Rana?
Yes, I actually wanted to jump in to piggyback off of what Jumaana was saying about her story, which I loved so much. The two characters who are on the opposite ends of the spectrum, where one character had lived in Palestine and had like personal like history there, and the other had never been. And there was a scene that was so real when they encounter the IDF soldier, and he asks the character who had never been to Palestine say something in Arabic, and her accent comes out as Egyptian because she was half Palestinian, half Egyptian. And he just laughs, and I have it open. "You can keep going," he said. "We only stop Palestinians." And that felt so real. So real, because it's almost like as Palestinians, we have almost fewer rights, for going back to Palestine, or for our rights there, right? Without going into a lot of details, but a couple of years ago, we were trying to go to Palestine, my husband and I, and he only has American citizenship, whereas I have American and Palestinian, like West Bank ID, and just like he can go in and go to everywhere in Palestine, including the like Israeli territory, whereas I'm limited. And that scene like spoke to me so deeply, where I was like, of course, like as Palestinians, like of course. And also, to add on to that, my husband ended up having issues because he's married to me. So if he was just an American citizen with no relationship to a Palestinian, he could go anywhere. But he ended up getting some issues because like it felt like, Israel is saying like, how dare you? Like, how dare you build relationships with like, you will be punished for this. And so in the diaspora, like I've lived in both in Palestine and outside, and sometimes I might feel in certain situations like that one, where I'm like, oh yeah, I'm so Palestinian, I'm getting stopped from coming in here. And sometimes I don't feel Palestinian enough because I feel like I live in this like privilege outside of Palestine, where life is easier. And so yeah, I just really wanted to bring that up because that seems so much to me.
Yeah, when I initially framed this I actually talked about it on Twitter before I started any like serious planning. There were people, like the first reactions that I got, aside from people who were not Palestinian and who were very encouraging about the project and that they wanted to see Palestinian speculative fiction. The second reaction I got was from Palestinians in the diaspora who wanted to know like my criteria for saying like, you are a Palestinian writer. And that really was very emotional for me to hear. Like, I am also a Palestinian in the diaspora, so I understand, but also like hearing it from people, saying like, well, they're using a lot of like blood quantum terms, like I'm half or I'm 3/4 and things like that, which is language that I've sort of weaned out of my life. So I don't talk about myself as being half anything anymore. I'm like Palestinian and whatever else. So it was emotional right from the start with diaspora Palestinians who didn't really feel like they had a license to enter this conversation.
Oh God, yeah.
Yeah, Layla?
Yeah, I just wanted to, bring up something Fazila's question made me think of regarding the diaspora. I'm 61 years old, and my diaspora experience, started out with my dad every Sunday morning listening to Voice of America in Arabic on the shortwave. And, a phone call from Jordan or Ramallah was a huge deal, and quite expensive, and just how quickly it's changed. And I think I think we're more, well, definitely we're more transnational now. You know, like even with the Baladi, you know, I published a few young women who are still in Gaza writing poetry. And it's like a concept I haven't quite grasped yet, that we could be messaging on Instagram in the midst of all of that. And so I do think something about diaspora has changed, where we are more connected right now than the traditional idea of diaspora, if that makes sense. Or my traditional idea of diaspora, which is I'm in the middle of North Texas and I don't know any Arabs. I just hear Arabic on BBC and from my dad, you know, and some relatives, yeah. But
something that just came to my memory is we've been talking a little bit about the way that we maybe don't feel like we're Palestinian enough or in the right way. And something that occurred during the editorial process was that there were a lot of, not a lot, but there was a significant minority of submissions from people who were, now I had said in the call to submissions that, call for submissions, that you just had to identify as Palestinian. That was my criteria. And however you defined Palestinian, it was up to you. And I got a significant minority of submissions from people who did not identify as Palestinian. And they said, well, you know, like I'm involved with Palestinian activism, or I've been to Palestine, or I'm married to a Palestinian. And it just sort of struck me that there was, on the one hand, Palestinian writers who didn't feel like they had a license to be a part of this project. And then the daring of these people who, there was only the one criteria, and they were saying like, well, I know I don't fit the criteria, but could you just, you know, let me in anyway? You know, so that kind of strikes me, that kind of like in the industry, there's like people who are very much like willing to step into these spaces that minorities will, or marginalized people will create for themselves. And those marginalized people sometimes don't think that they fit in that space, and yet somebody from a majority culture will try to get in anyway.
Oh God. Yeah, that's what I don't want to be.
Did we have another question? I thought we may have one.
Ziyad, it was uncanny to hear you saying those questions about like, how will I feel when I get there? What will happen? What will it be like? Those questions are like literally in my short story peppered throughout, because I'm constantly thinking about that. And I even get blocked at the point of arrival, to the point where my short story ends as soon as she emerges from the tunnel and she's there. I was like, I can't go further than this, because I just don't even know how. So that was uncanny. I think like it's as I can't remember who was saying it, that there's so many like recurrent themes and thoughts popping up around us. It was Samah saying like, this is obviously written by a people.
We have one question in the chat there, Sonia. Yeah, it's from A. Roach. They're saying, how do you think of your work in conversation with other speculative fiction genres? I'm thinking about genres like magical realism or others that have clear political / anti-colonial perspectives. How can solidarity be built across different areas of fiction and world building? It's a big question, so I think this will probably be our last one.
Yeah.
Maybe I could answer that. I reckon Emad has some good insight.
I just had one comment about what you said, Jumaana, which I think is relevant to this. Is I think what you said is very profound, like the way that it just ends very abruptly, because you have difficulty as a diaspora Palestinian imagining the homecoming, the actual moment. And I think that building solidarity with other colonized peoples, we have this in common, that we're trying to imagine a future, and there's colonial systems that are always sort of foreclosing our future so that we can't quite reach it even in our imaginations. So I feel like that was very profound at the end of your story, how it goes. And I think that those commonalities with other colonized speculative fiction genres, I do see similarities between my own work because I write about Palestinian folklore, but I don't like using the label of magical realism because my understanding of it, and I may be incorrect, but my understanding of it is much more like that particular genre is so a part of its land and its place in this culture that I don't feel comfortable using it for my own work. So I tend to say my work is fabulism, because I'm using folkloric elements or actual folk tales retold and shaped. But I do see like the overlap in how there is that kind of, I think, Jumaana, you've mentioned spiritual realism. There's that element that I do see, like the kind of rhyming of those genres in what I am writing and what I see in Palestinian speculative fiction that I've read. I don't know who put their hand up first, so we'll go with Ziyad.
Sure. So in terms of solidarity, one of the things that has kept me going throughout this past year is seeing the amazing displays of solidarity all around the world, people like protesting by the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands in various parts of the world, but especially in the global south. And that's because they see the Palestinian struggle as very much their own. And I think that alone, in terms of writing these stories, I think that people will see themselves in these stories. And I think that's going to inspire a lot of them to kind of reach out and see how they can support us as artists. Because I have gotten a lot of people who are not Palestinian, who are writers, kind of reaching out to me, asking to see my stuff and telling me like they want to mention it to XYZ and try to kind of spread the word. And I think, there's, for those of you who are in Canada, I'm sure you know what's been happening with the Giller Prize Awards and how.
Did you want to just encapsulate what that's about for someone who might not?
Sure, yes, sorry. So the Giller Prize Awards are the top literary award in Canada, and last year pro-Palestine protesters showed up at the Giller Prize, which was airing live on air, and they pointed out that the sponsor, one of the main sponsors of the Giller Prize, which is Scotiabank, invests in Elbit, the weapons manufacturing company that supplies Israel with weapons to commit the genocide. So these pro-Palestine protesters went on air, on stage, and called out the Gillers for their complicity in art-washing genocide. They were arrested. The charges have still not been dropped. But like 2 days after, countless writers petitioned the Gillers to have the charges dropped and to separate from Scotiabank, or at least to get Scotiabank to separate from Elbit. And since then, in the year past, Scotiabank has already reduced drastically the amount of money that they've been investing in Elbit. And even the CEO of Elbit has admitted that it was because of the pressure that came from the Canadian literary community. So that is a big way that us telling our stories and reaching out to other people, especially others within the literary community or the art community, can translate into actual action that significantly helps. So it's a very big part of building solidarity. You know, what we're doing in terms of getting our stories out there.
Layla?
Yeah, I think these are great questions that A. Roach asked. And, you know, the first one about how do you think of your work in conversation with other speculative fiction genres? I see this as a time of idea generation. You know, so every culture, you know, the Armenians, you know, Armenians may be writing speculative fiction, but their speculations are going to emerge from their cultural folklore, and maybe many of the same things we're talking about, but there may be, you know, things specific to them. Same thing, you know, in terms of technology, how is technology impacting different regions? There's a lot of similarities, but there may be differences. And one big one I think of is Congo, who frankly is fueling a lot of, you know, the technology that we hold every day in our hand. And that, I think the speculative fiction on that would be very, very different, very interesting. So just, I mean, those are just some thoughts I'm having. In terms of building solidarity, I think at this time they're, you know, recognizing the similarities in terms, of course, of colonialism and imperialism, but also kind of listening and recognizing where things differ, where people might be coming to different conclusions are, you know, because of those differences. And then as I read this, one thing popped in my head was the poem, is it Najwan Darwish who remembers the Armenians? And just, you know, kind of, I think what I see happening on social media, really, where we as Palestinians are acknowledging other genocides that are happening right now, even. And I do see that going forward as maybe being something where more fictions may interact in some way. So,
Yeah, something that I forgot to mention is that this next anthology was actually inspired by an indigenous horror anthology called Never Whistle at Night. And it was suggested to me by somebody who is not a writer, and they were like, this is so potent. And it seems so integral that the anti-colonial horror fiction that was coming out of it, and this is a brilliant anthology. They said like this is just like tailor-made for the integral like anti-colonial project of Palestinians. So it's definitely this next anthology that's not even written yet is already in conversation.
Emad, were you going to say something earlier?
Yes, my story, The Digital Hydra, again. I was attending a seminar for the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies at the American University in Cairo. And the guy presenting, the person making the talk, he used this word virtual diaspora. And straight away, I got this crazy image in my head of a child with a disk drive in its head. And you know, the colonial power, the totalitarian power, erased that child's language and memory, and they slot in a disk drive, a floppy disk drive, to put in new memories and new history and new language. But the catch is there's such a thing as video game piracy. So the video game pirates, they crack the codes and they start putting the language back in and all these things. And in the process, the people on the island, which is under occupation or totalitarianized occupation, they can coordinate with their diaspora abroad, all virtually in their heads, and they can download things like lessons on political organization, diplomacy, international law, how to do elections, how to build a better future. And the irony of it is the island in question, it's the island of Atlantis after it surfaced out of the water levels went down, and the people who went there, they're actually immigrants. They're not actually descendants of the Atlanteans, and their language has nothing in common with them. And yet they've convinced themselves they're Atlanteans, and they've gained their freedom and their democracy against these totalitarian regimes that were trying to divide them. So virtual diaspora.
Yeah.
Do you think I could hand that story into the contest? Because I'd originally posted it online, but the website itself has gone down. So it technically counts as unpublished. Could that work?
Yeah, I think so. If
Okay.
yeah, the rights would have probably reverted to you,
Cool.
I think.
That's great.
Layla, do you still have your hand up? Did you have something to add? No. Oh, we have a couple minutes left, so I thought we'd just kind of go around and like you say like what your socials are and like where people can find you and any last words that you might have. So I can be found at soniasulaiman.com and on various social media sites as Sonia Sulaiman. I won't give my Instagram because it's very long. It's an Anishinaabe word, and it's hard for me to spell. I have a disability, and so it's like my memory is not that great. But that's where you can find me. And Jumaana?
You can find me at jumaanaabdu.com. It's just my name, no space. My Instagram handle is the same. All the links for my short stories will be in the publications tab of my website. And my novel, I don't know how you guys can access it internationally, but it'd just be on the Penguin website. It's called Translations.
Layla?
I was typing it in the chat. You can find me on Layla Goushey on Instagram. And also I'm putting my magazine link in there as well, which Sonia has a story on.
Yes, I do. Which also was on a website that went down. So then she kindly, yeah, you kindly
that's right,
published it. So it had a home.
Yeah.
It was homeless for a while. Rena?
I don't have any public website, I don't have anything else to plug. I guess my only plug is to buy the book if you haven't already. Terribly not showing up on the screen, but that's all I got.
Thank you. Nadia?
Yeah, I'm on my website is nadiaafifi.com. Pretty simple. Also on Instagram is Nadia Writes Sci-Fi. And I attempt to TikTok as Nadia Afifi Writes Sci-Fi.
And Elise?
You can find me at elisestephens.com. I'm also on Facebook, and I'm leaving X probably, and I'm on Blue Sky. All of those are at Elise Stephens. Facebook, I'm author Elise Stephens, but pretty easy to find.
And Samah?
Yeah, I just linked my link tree on the chat. I have a website that I haven't updated in years, so probably not the best place to go. If not, I'm on Twitter, same thing, Samah Fadil, pretty active on there if you want to see me run my mouth. Yeah, pretty accessible everywhere, Instagram as well. And thank you so much for doing all of this. It's always so nourishing for the soul anytime I'm around other Palestinians, and it's really no exception tonight.
Absolutely. Emad?
I posted a link for an academic article of mine, which has my email in it. I do have a website, but I hardly use it. So, the email is more reliable. And it's a great article about Orientalism and Arabic science fiction.
And Ziyad.
So I don't have a website, but I put my email in the chat if anyone wants to reach me.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you for putting us together, all of it. Thank you so much.
This was a
Pleasure's
delight.
all mine.
Thank you so much, Sonia.
Bye.
And Art. Thank you to both of you.
Thank you, Art. Thanks everybody for
And Art, yes, thank you.
Yes.
Thank
thank
you.
so
Fernwood.
much.